So, first thing we want to talk about is technological advancement because of any of the characteristics of globalization, this is what's really driving globalization more and more rapidly over the past probably 3 or 4 decades. Um, and more so than in any other time period, what you see in the contemporary era, and especially towards the end of the 20th century, is almost universal technological advancement. Obviously, technology has advanced across the board since the first humans started sharpening rocks against one another. But the rate at which technology has advanced and the fact that it has advanced in almost every avenue, all right, in almost every scientific field, in almost every possible form of consumer good, is something that has not been seen ever in human history. Maybe with the initial creation of industrialization, but even at that time, technology was not expanding at the rate that it is now. You know, the you know the the industrial revolution is powered mainly by the steam engine, and although there are improvements on the steam engine over time, generally the steam engine remains the most consistent form of communication, or not communication, the most consistent and most widely used form of power until the creation of the internal combustion engine and large scale electric generators. That doesn't happen for almost 150 years after the steam engine is invented. Um, in the 40 years since the end of the Cold War, I mean, we've moved from landlines to satellite communication to high speed internet communication in a third of that time, right? So the rate of technological advancement and the multiple avenues are what really drive globalization, right? So let's take a look at some specific stuff. First and foremost, communications. Over the past 200 years, our ability to be in contact with other parts of the world has exploded. Beginning with the telegraph and the telephone, moving beyond there to satellite communications, cellular phones, and eventually the internet and what we call the information revolution. Um, Now, many of these forms of communication, like the radio and the internet, are originally devised for military purposes, but then are appropriated, the technology is appropriated by the corporate world, and then pretty soon it's shifted out into public consumer use. Um, and this enables us to do all sorts of things. Probably the most widely recognized advantage of this is cultural diffusion throughout the world. You see this in music, you see this in you see this in art, you see this in movies, television, online content. I mean, every avenue of what we create is in some way pushed out to the rest of the world thanks to the internet and the information revolution. And that is made possible by the fact that in roughly the same amount of time, data processing and analysis has expanded at an incredible rate. Um, if you own a phone and that phone is newer than an iPhone 4, right? Which everybody has newer than that now, right? Um, if you own an iPhone 4 or newer, in your pocket, you possess more computing power and data processing speed than all of the computers that were used to send the first man to the moon in 1969. Literally. Like, your iPhone has more data processing power, more RAM, more memory than the computers that accomplished probably the greatest feat of space exploration that we have ever accomplished, right? Um, and it's only getting faster. Since 1992, the speed of computer processing has doubled on average every 8.5 years. So within your lifetime, right, the speed of computers has more than quadrupled already. And by the time your kids are taking this class, it will have increased by a factor of 16 since then. It's pretty amazing. Um, there's been huge advancements in medical technology as well. Um, Probably the most important would be the development of antibiotics, the development of vaccines, and the development of birth control. Because of this, life expectancy worldwide has increased dramatically. There is still a pretty wide gap between first world and third world, but the numbers of life expectancy, even in developing countries, is still better than it was in developed countries at the start of the 20th century. So we have increased our ability to stay alive. We have increased our ability to control our own health dramatically. Probably most important of this was the creation of vaccines. Jonas Salk, an American medical professor, is credited with kind of the invention of the vaccine, um, curing polio in the 1950s. Birth control, especially in the form of chemical birth control, has created a nearly social revolution, empowering women dramatically in the past 30 to 40 years to now have more control over their reproductive system, um, to allow them to engage sexually and socially on a somewhat even playing field as men, because now they have more control over their sexuality, they have more control over their bodies, as well as the ability to not be chained to motherhood and home life. Now, the thing about these medical advancements is that as we advance so rapidly, a lot of times, and if you've ever seen the original Jurassic Park, this will sound familiar to you. We've stood on the shoulder of giants, and we've been so fast to figure out what we can do. Sometimes we haven't ever stopped to ask what we should do, right? And a lot of religious, moral, and ethical questions still exist about a lot of these technological advancements. Things like birth control, abortion are still massive political and cultural topics. Um, Genetics, our ability to play with human DNA to clone things, the use of stem cells to generate new tissues and new organs, still to this day is raising quite a bit of moral questions in terms of, are we playing God? Are we trying to surpass what natural abilities we were given? In terms of agriculture, because of our increased birth rate, because of our increased life expectancy, the population in the last half a century has grown again faster than it ever has in human history. So, to meet the needs of that growing population, we have had to change the ways in which food is produced, in which the way it is preserved, in the ways in which it is stored. And this has led to what we know as the Green Revolution. And this is an important topic for you guys to know. The Green Revolution begins in the 50s and 60s, mainly to provide alternate food sources for developing countries. Northern India, in an area known as the Punjab, was kind of the testing ground for this Green Revolution. And this includes the use of chemical fertilizers, chemical insecticides, automation in farming. This also means the use of chemical preservatives to keep food fresher and edible longer. If you've ever seen Super Size Me, you'll know all about chemical preservatives. You also have the introduction of freeze drying, which allows for food to be stored and shipped worldwide. But probably the biggest kind of catch-all phrase in the Green Revolution is the phrase GMO, genetically modified organism. Now, there is quite a lot of pushback against GMOs currently because we don't quite know what the after effects on the human body are going to be. But for a lot of developing areas of the world, GMOs are a necessity of survival. Um, Basically, what has happened is we have spliced the DNA of specific plants, namely wheat, corns, and cereals, to produce new varieties of that food that grow faster, that grow more productively, that are that can be grown in harsher climates. We have developed certain strands of foods that are more resistant to insects, that are more resistant to blight, so that entire crops don't get wiped out in the way that, say, the Irish potato famine did. However, again, we don't know what the impact of these GMOs is going to be on our lifespan, our health, the environment overall. So, again, as we rush forward, there are moral, ethical, and environmental questions that need to be answered. So, on this chart, this is one of my favorite charts to show people, especially considering that nowadays the anti-vaxxer movement is out there. And anytime I run across one of these anti vaxxer people, I love to show them things like this because, yeah, you can't argue with facts. And these are the facts. Polio was a massive childhood disease all through the early half of the 20th century. In 1952, Jonas Salk develops a polio vaccine. It is released publicly free of charge. Imagine that. Can you imagine that? A drug company releasing a drug free of charge. Amazing. Anyway, it's released free of charge through the United States government in 1955. And as you can see via the chart there, by roughly 1963, polio as a disease is wiped out. This is a disease that was killing tens of thousands of children a year. And within 8 years of the vaccine's introduction, it is eradicated completely. So, yeah, again, you can't argue with facts. Vaccines are good for us. I don't care what anybody else tells you. Vaccines are good for us. Now, some areas where technological advancement has generally, for the most part, benefited us in the environment is our explorations of alternate forms of energy and generating power. Um, Typically, over the past 200 years since industrialization, coal, oil, and gas have been the primary source of all energy worldwide. We all know the side effects of this. In order to release the energy stored within these fuels, you must burn them, and burning them gives off chemical byproducts. Um, Not all of those chemical byproducts are good for the environment. So we have been in the last, I would say, 50 years or so, exploring all sorts of new forms of energy, from hydroelectric to nuclear to wind to ethanol to solar. Um, all of these in an effort to create a cleaner source of energy. And in a lot of cases, our opinions of different forms of energy have evolved over time. When nuclear power was first introduced in the 60s and 70s, there was widespread panic in some places that nuclear power was going to kill us all. And nuclear accidents like the one in 3 Mile Island in the United States and the one in Chernobyl in 1986 kept those fears very alive. But as new forms of energy are introduced, and as the environmental issues with fossil fuels increase, we have had to be more open and more willing to explore new forms of energy. Um, this environmental shift away from fossil fuels towards green energy is definitely a positive step environmentally. However, it is somewhat hindered by cost. Generally, these types of energy initiatives have to be government projects because they are still not yet cost effective for the consumer world, although solar is getting to that point pretty rapidly. Um, travel is another area in which we have advanced dramatically. In the past 50 years, you've seen the advent of commercial jets, high speed trains, and commercial container shipping. This has made not only travel more affordable for us, but because of the rapid advancement of high volume container shipping, this has also reduced the cost of goods. This is part of the reason why you can go to Walmart and buy a t-shirt made in Sri Lanka, which is, I don't know, 4,500 miles away from where you live, and it's only $4.99. That shouldn't be possible. It really shouldn't. Um, between the cotton, the dye, and the labor used in making that shirt, it should be $4.99 in Sri Lanka, let alone shipping it all the way to the United States to your local Walmart. But because of high volume container shipping, we're able to do things like this. One of the best examples I've ever heard of this, and I don't know if this is still currently true because I heard about this in, I want to say 2009, is beef from Scotland. So this is how affordable globalized shipping has become. As late as 2009, ranchers in Scotland, right? If you don't know where Scotland is, go open up a map somewhere. Ranchers in Scotland, rather than slaughtering their own beef and having it butchered in Scotland, would ship live cattle from Scotland all the way to West Africa, countries like Ghana and Mali, have it slaughtered and butchered in Ghana and Mali, freeze dried, and shipped back to Scotland to be sold. And because shipping is so cost effective, and because labor in West Africa is so cheap, it actually was cheaper to ship the beef, to ship the freaking live animals from Scotland to West Africa, a distance of like 1,200 miles, slaughter and butcher them there, and then ship the finished product back to Scotland to be sold, than it would have been to just have butchers in Scotland do the job. Again, that really shouldn't be possible. So this is what we talk about when we talk about high volume container shipping. Um, each of those little Lego block looking things that you see there is a 20 by 10 foot, 20 by 10 by 10 foot shipping container. Each of those can hold roughly, I mean, depending upon the product and the size and the shape of it, it can hold roughly somewhere between a ton to a ton and a half of goods. And as you can see, because of our ability to create bigger, faster, more efficient shipping methods, you can move roughly a couple 100,000 pounds of product, whatever, around the world in a matter of weeks rather than months or years, right? And you can see from the chart how rapidly this is expanding. From 1996 to 2013, right? The amount of global shipping in the container trade increases from a little over 50 million of those TEUs, those God, I forget what TEU stands for. Look it up. It's trans something unit. Essentially, it's one of those shipping containers, right? So the numbers of shipping containers moving worldwide from 1996 to 2013 goes from somewhere around 50 million to almost 170 million in, let's see, less than 20 years. So, I mean, that's an increase of threefold in only 3 decades.